The freezing river was supposed to claim the life of Chicago's most ruthless billionaire. Instead, it stripped away her armor. What happens when a desperate single father pulls his untouchable boss from the wreckage, only to uncover a terrifying secret she's hidden beneath silk and silence for a decade? Thomas Reed didn't belong at the Blackwood Ridge Executive Retreat. He was a mid-level logistics manager at Carmichael Industries, a man who spent his days optimizing supply chains and his nights calculating how to stretch his paycheck to cover his 7-year-old daughter's asthma medications. His late wife, Rebecca, had passed away 3 years prior in a hit-and-run, leaving Thomas with a mountain of medical debt and a shattered heart. He was only on this mountain because the IT director had fallen ill, and Thomas needed the overtime pay. At the center of the retreat was Josephine Carmichael. At 34, Josephine was a billionaire CEO known on Wall Street as the Ice Queen. She was brilliant, demanding, and entirely unapproachable. No one knew anything about her personal life. She wore impeccably tailored suits and, regardless of the season, a high, tightly wound silk scarf around her neck. Rumors circulated the water cooler. Some said she was hiding a scandalous tattoo. Others whispered about a rare skin condition. Anyone brave enough to stare too long was promptly fired. The retreat was a disaster from the start. A freak October storm rolled through the Appalachian Mountains, turning the winding dirt roads into rivers of mud. Recognizing the danger, Josephine called off the event on the second day, ordering everyone back to the city. Thomas was the last to leave, tasked with packing up the server equipment into the company's supply van. The rain was coming down in blinding horizontal sheets as he finally navigated his way down the treacherous mountain pass. The radio cracked with weather warnings, but it was the sudden, horrifying screech of tires ahead that made Thomas slam on his brakes. Through the deluge, he saw it. Josephine Carmichael's black, armored SUV had smashed through the wooden guardrail. It teetered for a heart-stopping second on the edge of the ravine before plunging nose first into the swollen, raging waters of the Ocoee River below. Thomas didn't think. The instincts of a father and a protector overrode any corporate hierarchy. He threw the van in park, grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from his toolkit, and scrambled down the muddy embankment, slipping and sliding through the briars. The river was a chaotic churn of white water and debris. The SUV was rapidly taking on water, pinned against a massive boulder. Thomas plunged into the freezing rapids. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. The current violently pulled at his legs, threatening to sweep him downstream, but he fought his way to the driver's side. Through the tinted glass, he saw Josephine. Her driver was slumped over the wheel, unconscious and bleeding heavily, while Josephine was frantically slamming her fists against the reinforced passenger window. The water level inside the cabin was rising to her chest. Bracing his boots against the slippery rock, Thomas swung the crowbar with everything he had. The armored glass spiderwebbed but held. "Get back!" he screamed over the roaring water, hoping she could read his lips. He swung again, aiming for the corner of the window. This time, the glass shattered inward. The river immediately rushed into the vehicle, equalizing the pressure. Thomas reached in, unbuckled her seatbelt blindly beneath the freezing water, and grabbed her by the lapels of her custom blazer. "I've got you!" he yelled, hauling her out of the window. She was gasping, coughing up river water, her usually pristine hair plastered to her face. Thomas wrapped his arm around her waist, fighting the relentless pull of the river. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony as he dragged them both toward the muddy shoreline, finally collapsing onto the wet grass. They were alive. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, equally deadly threat emerged: the freezing mountain air. "We can't stay here." Thomas panted, forcing himself to his feet. His teeth were already chattering. "We'll freeze to death in 20 minutes." Josephine was on her hands and knees, violently shivering, her eyes wide with a terror that completely shattered her boardroom persona. My driver," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't reach him," Thomas said, the grim reality heavy in his chest. "The car went under. I'm sorry. We have to move, Miss Carmichael. Now." He remembered passing an old, abandoned ranger station about a half-mile back up the road. Half carrying, half dragging the billionaire CEO, Thomas trudged through the relentless storm. By the time they kicked open the rotting wooden door of the cabin, dusk had fallen, and the temperature was plummeting toward freezing. The cabin was bare, save for an ancient wood stove and a pile of dry, chopped wood left by hikers. Thomas immediately set to work, using dry pine needles and a flare from his emergency kit to get a fire roaring. The small space slowly began to fill with warmth. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Thomas said, turning to her. He pulled a dry fleece pullover from his waterproof duffel bag. "Put this on. I'll turn around." Josephine was huddled in the corner, her lips blue. Her expensive suit was soaked, clinging to her freezing body. Yet her hands were rigidly gripping the wet, heavy silk scarf around her neck, refusing to let it go, even as the cold, wet fabric drained her body heat. I can't," she chattered, her knuckles white. "Miss Carmichael, you are going into hypothermia," Thomas said, his tone shifting from employee to the firm, commanding voice of a father who knew what had to be done. "Pride doesn't matter right now. If you don't take off those wet layers, your organs will start shutting down. You have a daughter, right? I read it in a company memo once. I have a little girl, Chloe. I need to get home to her, and you need to get home to yours. Take off the wet clothes." Josephine looked at him, her hardened exterior cracking completely. Tears mingled with the river water on her cheeks. She shrugged off the ruined blazer and the soaked blouse, slipping the oversized fleece over her head. But still, the wet silk scarf remained tightly wound around her neck, the ends tucked into the collar. Thomas sighed, sitting by the fire and rubbing his hands together. "Why are you so stubborn?" he muttered, mostly to himself. "Because if people see the damage, they see the weakness," she whispered, her voice trembling, not just from the cold, but from an exhaustion that seemed to run bone deep. The silence stretched between them, save for the crackling of the wood stove. The warmth was returning to the room, but the psychological tension was thick enough to cut. Thomas watched the flames, thinking of his late wife, Rebecca. He remembered how she used to hide her own insecurities, how the world forced people to wear masks. "My wife died 3 years ago," Thomas said quietly, not looking at her. "Hit and run on the south side. They never caught the guy. For a year, I walked around in a suit, went to work, and pretended I was perfectly fine. I hid the damage. But all it did was slowly poison me from the inside. Weakness isn't having scars, Miss Carmichael. Weakness is letting them dictate how you live." Josephine's breath hitched. She stared at Thomas, her eyes darting across his face as if searching for a trap. Her trembling fingers slowly moved up to the knot of the soaked silk. "You saved my life today, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking but gaining a strange, desperate clarity. She paused, her fingers lingering on the silk. "Would you stay if I took this off?" she asked, the vulnerability in her eyes so raw it made Thomas's chest ache. "Would you still look at me like a human being?" "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas promised softly. Slowly, agonizingly, Josephine unwound the wet silk scarf. As it dropped to the wooden floor, Thomas saw it. It wasn't a tattoo. It was a horrific, jagged burn scar that covered the entire left side of her neck, stretching down toward her collarbone, the unmistakable mark of a catastrophic chemical fire or a terrible wreck. But that wasn't what made Thomas's blood run ice cold. Resting against the scarred skin at her collarbone, hanging from a delicate silver chain, was a locket. A very specific, custom-engraved silver locket shaped like a crescent moon. Thomas stopped breathing. He recognized the scratch on the clasp. He recognized the intricate engraving. It was the exact locket he had given his wife, Rebecca, on their 5th anniversary. The locket she was wearing the night she was killed. The locket the police said was lost in the accident. Thomas stood up slowly, the warmth of the fire completely forgotten. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. Josephine looked down at the locket, then up at Thomas, the terror returning to her eyes. Only this time, it wasn't fear of the river. It was the fear of a ghost returning to haunt her. "Thomas," she whispered, stepping back. "I can explain." The roaring of the wind against the cabin's fragile wooden exterior faded into an eerie, suffocating silence. Thomas stared at the crescent moon locket, his mind violently rejecting what his eyes were seeing, the scratch on the silver clasp, the intricate, hand-tooled engraving of a constellation on the back. It was undeniable. He had commissioned that piece from a small jeweler in West Town. He had fastened it around Rebecca's neck, just hours before she drove to the grocery store and never returned. "Take it off," Thomas said. His voice was no longer the comforting tone of a rescuer. It was a hollow, dangerous rasp that vibrated with a rising tide of fury. Josephine flinched, her hands trembling as she reached behind her scarred neck. She unhooked the clasp, the delicate chain pooling into her pale palm, and held it out to him as if it were a live grenade. Thomas snatched it from her grasp. The silver was warm from her skin, a sickening contrast to the freezing dread pooling in his stomach. "The police searched the wreckage for hours," Thomas whispered, his eyes locked on the tarnished metal. "They told me scavengers must have taken it, or that it melted in the engine fire." He finally raised his head, his gaze piercing through Josephine's terrified facade. "How do you have my dead wife's locket? Were you the one driving?" Josephine pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible on the dusty floorboards. The invincible billionaire CEO was completely gone, replaced by a broken woman suffocating under the weight of a 3-year-old secret. "I wasn't driving," she choked out, tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting through the soot on her cheeks. "But I was in the passenger seat. And I am so, so sorry, Thomas. God, I am so sorry." Thomas took a step back, hitting the rough-hewn wall of the cabin. The air in his lungs felt like shattered glass. "Who?" he demanded, the word erupting from him in a shout that rattled the ancient windows. "Who was driving the car that left my wife to bleed out on the asphalt?" "My father," Josephine cried, her voice cracking. "Harrison Carmichael." The name landed between them like a physical blow. Harrison Carmichael, the former CEO, the ruthless titan of Chicago industry, a man who had retired with honors and a golden parachute 2 years ago. "We were coming back from a charity gala," Josephine continued, the words tumbling out of her in a frantic, desperate rush as the dam finally broke. He had been drinking heavily. He refused to let the chauffeur drive because he wanted to discuss a confidential merger. It was raining just like tonight. The roads were slick. We came through the intersection on 43rd Street, and he blew straight through the red light. He was looking at his phone. Thomas. He never even hit the brakes. Thomas closed his eyes, a wave of profound nausea washing over him. The horrific images he had spent years trying to suppress in therapy came flooding back with agonizing clarity. "The impact spun your wife's car into the concrete divider," Josephine whispered, her eyes fixed blindly on the flickering flames of the wood stove. "Our SUV was armored. We barely felt the shock. But her car—" The front end crumpled. Smoke started pouring from the hood immediately. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I had my hand on the door handle. I told him we had to call an ambulance, that we had to get her out. She paused, lifting a trembling hand to touch the jagged, angry red scar tissue covering her neck and collarbone. "He locked the doors," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow, haunted cadence. "He looked at the wreckage, calculated the risk to his reputation, his stock prices, his empire, and he locked the doors. He told me it was a tragic accident, but that the Carmichael legacy would not end because of a patch of wet asphalt. I fought him. I screamed. I hit him in the face with my purse and unlocked my door." Thomas stood frozen, his knuckles white around the silver locket. "You got out," he stated flatly. "I got out," she nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I ran to her car. The driver's side door was jammed shut. The hood was already in flames. I looked through the shattered window. Rebecca. She was still conscious. She was trapped under the steering column. Hearing his wife's name in this stranger's mouth made Thomas's knees buckle. He slid down the wall, sitting on the floor across from her, his breathing ragged. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't tell me this." "You deserve the truth," Josephine said firmly, looking him directly in the eyes with a sudden, fierce candor. I tried to pry the door open. I grabbed the burning metal of the window frame. That's when the engine flashed over. The fireball caught the left side of my body. She pointed to her scar. I fell back on the pavement, screaming. My father grabbed me by the arms and dragged me away. But before he pulled me back to our car, Rebecca reached through the broken window. She couldn't feel her legs. She knew she wasn't going to make it. She pulled the locket off her neck and pressed it into my hand. Josephine's voice broke completely into a wretched sob. She grabbed my collar and said, "Tell him I love him. Tell my little girl." And then my father dragged me into the SUV, and he drove away. We left her there to burn, Thomas. We left her there. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the crackling of the dying fire and the ragged, agonizing sounds of Thomas weeping. He pressed the cold silver locket against his forehead, the grief pulling him under the suffocating waves all over again. The anger inside him was a living, breathing monster, screaming for vengeance, demanding that he throw the doors open and leave this woman to freeze in the mountains just as she had left Rebecca to die. "Why?" Thomas finally croaked out, his eyes red and blazing with a fury that made Josephine shrink back. "Why didn't you go to the police? Why didn't you come find me? You are a billionaire. You have armies of lawyers. You let him get away with murder, and you let me bury my wife in a closed casket while you hid in a penthouse." "Because he owned me," Josephine shouted back, the frustration and self-loathing bubbling to the surface. "He owned the police commissioner. He owned the judge who would have heard the case. He locked me in a private wing of a hospital for 3 months under the guise of an infectious disease while my burns healed. He threatened to frame me for the accident, Thomas. He told me that if I breathed a word, he would make sure your daughter lost the meager life insurance payout you received. I was a prisoner in my own life." She wiped her face with the back of her fleece sleeve, sitting up straighter, the firelight catching a hard, calculating glint in her eyes that Thomas recognized from the corporate memos. "So, I stopped crying and I started planning," she said, her tone dropping into a chilling calm. "I played the obedient daughter. I let him think he broke me. I started wearing the scarves. I climbed the corporate ladder, ruthless and unquestioning, until he trusted me enough to hand over the keys to the kingdom. I became the CEO, and for the last 2 years, I have been meticulously dismantling his life. Thomas frowned, the pure rage confusingly interrupted by her sudden shift in demeanor. "What are you talking about? Why do you think you got the job at Carmichael Industries, Thomas?" she asked softly. "You didn't have the required master's degree. HR rejected your application. I overrode it. I made sure you were placed in a department with minimal travel so you could be home with Chloe. When HR tried to deny coverage for Chloe's expensive asthma inhalers, I personally rewrote the corporate healthcare policy to cover chronic pediatric respiratory illnesses. I couldn't bring Rebecca back. I couldn't come to you and confess without my father destroying you to silence me. So I protected you from the shadows." Thomas stared at her, his mind reeling as the puzzle pieces of the last 2 years violently snapped into place. The unexpected bonuses, the sudden miraculous approval of Chloe's medical appeals, the promotion that kept him off the night shifts. It had all been orchestrated by the woman wearing his dead wife's locket. "This retreat," Josephine continued, her voice gaining strength, "it wasn't a team-building exercise. It was a distraction. While my father's loyalists were trapped up here on this mountain, my private auditors submitted a 4,000-page dossier to the FBI in Chicago. It details every bribe my father paid, every corrupt official he bought, and most importantly, the exact GPS telemetry data from his armored SUV on the night of Rebecca's death. The data he thought he deleted. I recovered it." She looked down at her hands. "By the time the sun comes up and we get off this mountain, Harrison Carmichael will be in federal custody. The cover-up is over. I brought him down, Thomas. I finally did it." The storm broke just before dawn. The torrential rain faded into a soft, steady drizzle, and the howling wind died down to a tired whisper through the Appalachian pines. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Thomas hadn't slept. He sat by the wood stove, the locket tightly clutched in his fist, his eyes fixed on the small window. The sky was slowly turning a bruised shade of purple and grey. Josephine was huddled on the opposite side of the room, her knees pulled up to her chest, shivering under the oversized fleece. She was staring at him, waiting for the verdict. She had handed him the sword. He could ruin her. Even with her turning in the evidence against her father, she was an accessory after the fact. If Thomas pushed it, if he took his story to the press, he could ensure that Josephine Carmichael went to prison right alongside her father. "I hated you," Thomas said, his voice raspy, breaking the hours of agonizing silence. "Even before I knew who you were, I saw you in the elevators, the Ice Queen, untouchable, perfect. I hated you because my life was a constant, terrifying struggle to keep my daughter breathing, while you looked like you didn't have a care in the world." Josephine didn't flinch. She accepted the words, nodding slowly. "I know. I saw the way you looked at me. It was the same way I looked at myself in the mirror." Thomas stood up, his joints popping from the cold and the residual adrenaline of the rescue. He walked over to her. Josephine tensed, squeezing her eyes shut, preparing for him to yell, to strike her, or to simply walk out the door and leave her there. Instead, Thomas crouched down in front of her. He reached out and gently laid the silver locket on the floorboards between them. "Rebecca was a nurse," Thomas said quietly. "She spent her life trying to heal people who were broken. She didn't care how they got broken. She just wanted to stop the bleeding. When she handed you this locket, she wasn't just asking you to pass on a message. She was trying to give you a piece of her strength so you could survive the monster pulling you away. Josephine opened her eyes, fresh tears welling up. She stared at the locket, then up at Thomas, her expression radiating a profound, devastating vulnerability. "You don't owe me an apology, Josephine," Thomas said, using her first name for the first time. "You were a victim of Harrison Carmichael just as much as Rebecca was. You were trapped in a burning car of your own making, and you've spent the last 3 years figuring out how to break the glass." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his own cell phone, and checked the screen. 1 bar of service. The storm interference was finally clearing. "I'm calling the state troopers," Thomas said, standing up and turning away to give her a moment of privacy. "We need to get you to a hospital. Hypothermia is still a risk." As he dialed the emergency number, he heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him. When he turned back around, Josephine was picking up the silk scarf from where it had been discarded near the fire. She looked at the damp, ruined fabric for a long moment. Then, with a trembling hand, she tossed it directly onto the glowing embers of the wood stove. It smoked, caught fire, and withered into ash. She left her scarred neck completely bare. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, her voice carrying a fragile, newfound peace. 2 hours later, the rhythmic thumping of chopper blades shattered the mountain quiet. A search and rescue helicopter touched down in the muddy clearing outside the ranger station. Paramedics rushed the cabin, wrapping them both in thermal blankets. As they were loaded into the helicopter, Thomas watched Josephine. The paramedics tried to apply a dressing over her neck, assuming the burn was a fresh injury from the crash. Josephine gently pushed the medic's hand away, shaking her head. "It's an old wound," she said, her voice steady and clear over the roar of the rotors. "It's finally healing." The aftermath in Chicago was swift and brutal, playing out exactly as Josephine had engineered. When they touched down at the hospital, FBI agents were already waiting. Harrison Carmichael had been arrested at his Gold Coast estate at 4 a.m., dragged out in handcuffs in front of local news crews. The GPS data, combined with the financial paper trail of bribes Josephine had uncovered, made the case airtight. Josephine did not return to the corporate penthouse. Upon her release from the hospital, she formally resigned as CEO of Carmichael Industries. She pled guilty to a lesser charge of obstruction of justice, leveraging her extensive cooperation and the horrific circumstances of her coercion into a suspended sentence and 5,000 hours of community service. The board of directors, scrambling to distance themselves from Harrison's radioactive legacy, quietly liquidated his assets to settle the massive, wrongful death lawsuit Thomas filed. A lawsuit Josephine's own lawyers had secretly helped him draft. 6 months later, spring had finally arrived in Chicago, melting away the bitter frost. Thomas stood in the sunlit playground of a private pediatric clinic, a clinic entirely funded by a new, anonymous trust. He watched his daughter Chloe swinging happily on the monkey bars, her laughter ringing clear and bright, untroubled by the wheezing that used to plague her. The settlement had ensured she would never want for medical care, education, or anything else for the rest of her life. A quiet set of footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind him. Thomas turned. Josephine stood there, dressed not in a sharp, intimidating power suit, but in a simple, soft wool sweater and jeans. The jagged burn scar on her neck was visible, completely unhidden by any scarf or collar. She looked older, yet infinitely lighter, as if a literal boulder had been removed from her shoulders. "She looks happy," Josephine said softly, watching Chloe. "She is," Thomas smiled. She asked about the lady who helped us buy the new house. I told her she was a friend. Josephine's eyes watered, but she smiled back, a genuine, warm expression that the corporate world had never been privileged to see. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, holding it out to Thomas. "I had it cleaned," she said. "The soot is gone. I thought it was time it came home." Thomas took the box and opened it. The silver crescent moon locket rested on the black velvet, polished and gleaming in the spring sunlight. He looked at the locket, then at the woman who had carried it through the darkest years of her life to ensure justice was finally served. "Would you like to stay?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the empty park bench beside him. "We brought extra sandwiches. Chloe talks a lot, but she makes good company." Josephine looked at the bench, then at Thomas, her scarred neck held high and unashamed. "I would like that very much," she said. The truth did not erase the tragedy, but it finally allowed their deepest wounds to close. Josephine paid her legal dues, trading her boardroom empire for a quiet life of genuine redemption. Thomas and Chloe found peace, no longer haunted by agonizing, unanswered questions. Sometimes the most profound healing begins not when we put our heavy armor on, but in the terrifying moments when we dare to take it completely off.